The workshop smelled of brass polish and whale oil that October morning, the familiar scents mixing with the dampness that crept in from Lake Geneva, despite the coal stove's best efforts. Our instrument maker, let us not burden him with a name, for he could be any of a dozen such craftsmen working in Geneva that autumn of 1863, sat hunched over his workbench, adjusting the crosshairs of a surveyor's theodolite with a steadiness that 42 years had not yet stolen from his hands. The letter arrived with the 9 o'clock post, its cream envelope bearing the kind of elaborate wax seal that always made him pause. The wealthy, he thought, while carefully breaking the seal with his penknife. They must mark everything as theirs, even their correspondence. The paper inside was thick, expensive, and bore the letterhead of Villa Montrose. "Most esteemed master," it began in French, though he detected a German stiffness in the phrasing. "We require your immediate expertise regarding a matter of utmost delicacy concerning our renowned atmospheric pressure measuring device." The letter continued with unnecessary flourishes about reputation and discretion before arriving at the heart. They needed him within 2 days. Payment would be most generous, and a boat would be arranged. He read it twice, then set it aside to finish the theodolite. The rich can wait another hour, he reasoned, though his mind had already begun its practical calculations. October was traditionally slow for astronomical instruments, what with the clouds settling in for winter. The workshop's rent would come due in 3 weeks, and there was still the matter of young Henri's funeral expenses. His apprentice's mother had proudly refused charity, but he'd been quietly settling the account with the undertaker nonetheless. By noon, he'd sent his acceptance and packed his traveling case. The essential tools, of course, but also his magnifying lenses, his mercury thermometer, and the small leather notebook where he recorded observations. Never trust memory alone, his own master had taught him 30 years ago, for memory reshapes itself like heated glass. The promised boat waited at the Paquis Pier the next morning, manned by a taciturn boatman who smelled of pipe tobacco and spoke in the clipped dialect of the Vaud countryside. As they pulled away from Geneva's shores, our craftsmen watched the city recede into the morning mist. The new railway station, completed just 5 years prior, dominated the skyline now, its iron and glass announcing the age they lived in more loudly than any town crier could. The journey across the lake took 3 hours, the autumn wind carrying hints of coming snow from the Alps. He spent the time reviewing what he knew of Villa Montrose and the Hauser family. Baron Wilhelm Hauser had made his fortune in the German railways, then married into French aristocracy. Marguerite something or other from Lyon. They'd bought the estate 10 years ago, transforming it into what the gossips called a temple to progress and tradition in equal measure. Their famous barometer, according to workshop chatter, had been installed 5 years ago with great ceremony. Strange, he mused, watching cormorants dive for fish, that they'd call me instead of Müller. Jakob Müller had serviced the estate's clocks for years and certainly knew his way around precision instruments. They'd apprenticed together under old Master Brenner, though Jakob had always been quicker to charm clients than to perfect his craft. Still, the man was competent enough. Villa Montrose appeared first as a pale shimmer against the dark tree line, then gradually revealed itself as they approached. 3 stories of cream-colored stone, with a kind of symmetrical facade that suggested French architectural ambitions wrestling with Swiss practicality. The gardens, even in October's decline, showed careful tending, though he noticed, for he noticed everything it was both blessing and curse of his profession, that the eastern hedge had been recently and roughly trimmed, as if someone had needed to remove evidence of neglect hastily. The butler who met them at the private dock was precisely what one would expect: French, impeccable, and possessed of that particular dignity that suggested he considered himself superior to both servants and guests alike. "Monsieur Fouché," he introduced himself, with a bow calibrated to acknowledge professional respect without implying equality. "The Baron awaits." As they walked up the gravel path, our craftsman observed the estate's curious mixture of ostentation and anxiety. The windows gleamed with recent cleaning, but dead leaves had gathered in corners where they wouldn't immediately catch the eye. A gardener worked furiously at replanting flower beds that should have been prepared weeks ago. A house preparing for judgment, he thought, though from whom or what remained unclear. The entrance hall took his breath away despite himself. The ceiling soared 30 feet high, supported by marble columns that belonged more in a cathedral than a private home. Gas lamps, still rare enough to impress, cast steady light on paintings that chronicled someone's ancestors in oils and gilt. But what commanded the space, what drew every eye like a compass needle to north, was the barometer. It stood 7 feet tall in its mahogany case, the glass tube thick as a man's wrist, the reservoir of mercury at its base gleaming like captured moonlight. The craftsmanship was exquisite, Italian certainly, probably Florentine from the decorative elements. The scale beside it was marked not just with measurements, but with elaborate engravings: cherubs for fair weather, demons for storms. "Magnificent, is it not?" Baron Hauser's voice came from behind him. The man himself was less impressive than his instrument. 58 years written in the lines around his eyes, gray whiskers attempting to lend gravity to a face that remained somehow boyish. "It has stood here for 5 years, never wrong once." Never wrong about what? Our craftsman wondered, but said only, "A beautiful piece, Baron. 17th century? 16th, we believe, from a monastery near Florence. The monks claimed it could predict more than weather." The Baron's laugh held an edge of something. Nervousness? "Superstitious nonsense, of course, but my wife insists it knows when family troubles are brewing. The mercury drops before every argument, she says." Behind the Baron, Fouché stood perfectly still, his face revealing nothing. But our craftsman, trained to observe the smallest variations in mechanical movement, caught the butler's nearly imperceptible glance toward the barometer, then away. The Baron led him deeper into the hall, their footsteps echoing on marble that had been polished to mirror brightness. "The problem," Baron Hauser explained, gesturing at the magnificent instrument, "is that lately it seems to be giving us false readings. Yesterday it showed fair weather while rain lashed the windows. Most disturbing." Our craftsman approached the barometer with the measured reverence one might show an altar, not from faith, but from respect for human craft elevated to art. The mercury column stood at 76 centimeters, precisely what one would expect for a clear October day at this elevation. He removed his pocket barometer, a reliable, if plain, instrument, and compared. Identical readings. "Tell me about its predictions," he said carefully, running his fingers along the mahogany case without quite touching the glass. "The family troubles your wife mentioned." The Baron's laugh carried forced lightness. Marguerite's feminine fancies. Though I admit there have been coincidences. Last month, before our eldest son Conrad had his disagreement with us about his finances, the mercury dropped to storm levels on a cloudless day. Interesting, thought our craftsman, that he calls them coincidences while standing here spending good money to investigate them. He'd learned long ago that what people said they believed and what they actually believed rarely aligned, like a telescope whose lenses had been knocked out of true. Might I examine it more closely? I'll need to check the vacuum, the purity of the mercury, the calibration against known standards. He kept his voice professionally neutral, though something about the instrument nagged at him, a wrongness he couldn't yet identify, like a clock whose tick was off by a fraction of a second. Of course, of course. Fouché will provide anything you need. We dine at 8. You'll join us, naturally. Your room has been prepared in the east wing. The Baron paused, seeming to wrestle with something. There is one other matter. My wife wishes the examination to be discreet. She has theories about certain members of the household tampering with it. Before he could respond, a young woman swept into the hall, her dress the deep blue of evening skies, her bearing suggesting education had been layered over natural curiosity rather than replacing it. "Papa, you didn't mention we had a visitor." "Isabel, this is the instrument specialist from Geneva. He's here about the barometer." She approached with unseemly directness for a woman of 23, extending her hand as a man might. "How fascinating. I've been reading about Torricelli's principles. Is it true that the weight of air itself holds up the mercury?" Her father shifted uncomfortably. "Isabel has scientific interests," he said, as one might apologize for a family member's mild madness. "Indeed, mademoiselle," our craftsman replied, accepting her handshake with careful propriety. 76 centimeters of mercury exactly balances the weight of our entire atmosphere. We live at the bottom of an ocean of air. Her eyes lit with genuine interest, but before she could respond, another voice cut through the hall like a saw through soft wood. "More money wasted on superstitions, father?" Conrad Hauser descended the main staircase with the studied casualness of someone who wanted to appear uninterested while ensuring he commanded attention. At 28, he had his mother's sharp features, but none of her grace, his movements somehow both languid and aggressive. Surely a man of business shouldn't concern himself with fortune-telling instruments. "Conrad," the Baron's tone carried warning, "the barometer is a valuable antique, requiring maintenance." "Of course, like everything in this museum we call home." Conrad's gaze fixed on our craftsman with the assessing look of someone calculating worth and finding it wanting. "I suppose you'll be here for days, billing us by the hour?" "I work by the job, not the hour," our craftsman replied mildly. "An honest day's work for an honest day's pay." Something flickered across Conrad's face. Surprise, perhaps, that a tradesman would respond at all. He opened his mouth, likely to deliver some cutting remark, but the barometer chose that moment to shudder slightly, the mercury column dropping 2 centimeters in the span of a heartbeat. Everyone froze. The silence stretched taut as wire, until Isabel whispered, "It's happening again." Our craftsman moved quickly to the instrument, his trained eye catching what others might miss. The tremor hadn't been uniform. The mercury had dropped in a series of tiny pulses, almost like... But no, that was impossible. Mercury in a vacuum tube couldn't pulse, unless... "You see?" The Baron's voice had gone tight. "This is what we mean. By evening, mark my words, we'll have chaos." Conrad laughed, harsh and short. Or perhaps someone knows that predicting conflict in this family is like predicting sunrise, inevitable and punctual. "Conrad," Isabel turned on her brother, "must you always—" "What, speak truth? Point out that we're letting a tube of metal dictate our fears?" The mercury dropped another centimeter. Fouché, who had been standing silent as furniture, stepped forward smoothly. "Perhaps the young masters would prefer to continue this discussion elsewhere?" "The specialist requires quiet for his work." It was masterfully done. Not quite an order, not quite a suggestion, delivered with the perfect tone that made resistance seem childish. Conrad sneered but turned away, while Isabel cast one more longing look at the barometer before following. Alone with Fouché and the Baron, our craftsman circled the instrument slowly. "Tell me, Baron, who else knows about these predictions?" "The family, of course. The senior staff, Dr. Leclerc. He's fascinated by what he calls domestic meteorology. A few close friends," the Baron hesitated. "My wife's nephew visited last month from Paris, a student of the natural sciences. He spent hours studying it." "And has anyone else examined it professionally? Cleaned it, perhaps, adjusted it?" "No one has touched it since installation except to dust the case. We were told any interference could damage the mechanism permanently." Interesting, thought our craftsman, that someone would say that about an instrument that has no mechanism beyond gravity and vacuum. He knelt beside the base, examining where the mahogany met the floor. There, barely visible unless you knew to look, were scratches in the wood, as if the massive case had been shifted slightly, repeatedly. "I'll need several days for a complete examination," he said, rising with the careful movements of a man whose knees reminded him of his age. "And I'll need access to this hall at unusual hours. The barometric pressure changes are most pronounced at dawn and dusk." "Whatever you require." The Baron seemed relieved to be dealing with practicalities. "Fouché will provide a key." As the Baron departed and Fouché moved to show him to his room, our craftsman took one last look at the barometer. The mercury had stabilized, but at a level that suggested an approaching storm, despite the clear skies visible through the tall windows. "Either this instrument is broken," he thought, "or it's measuring something other than air pressure." His fingers found the small leather notebook in his pocket, and he made his first entry. October 4th. Mercury falls without cause. Family reacts with practiced fear. Someone here understands more about pneumatics than they admit. Walking up the stairs behind Fouché's rigid back, he remembered something his dead apprentice Henri had said during his last visit to the workshop. "Master, what if an instrument could be made to lie? What if the lie was its true purpose?" He'd dismissed it then as philosophical meandering. Now, watching Fouché's too careful pace, noting how the butler's eyes never quite looked at the barometer directly, he wondered if poor Henri had been trying to tell him something more specific. 3 days into his examination, our craftsman had developed a routine that suited both his purposes and the household's rhythms. He rose before dawn, when the servants were busy with their morning tasks and the family still abed, allowing him to work undisturbed in the great hall. The barometer had become his puzzle, each measurement revealing new inconsistencies that shouldn't exist in such a simple instrument. That particular morning, October 7th, brought an unexpected complication in the form of a letter forwarded from his workshop. The elderly concierge's son had rowed across the lake specially to deliver it, which meant someone had paid considerably for the urgency. Our craftsman recognized the trembling handwriting immediately. Madame Dumont, Henri's mother. "Most honored master," she wrote, "I have found something among my son's effects that troubles me greatly. Papers with drawings I cannot understand, and repeated references to the mercury that rises in wrong places. There is also mention of Villa Montrose. I fear my Henri may have been involved in something dangerous before his accident. Please, I beg your counsel." He folded the letter carefully, his mind already racing through implications. Henri had indeed mentioned taking a brief position at a lakeside estate 3 months before his death, but he'd been vague about details, saying only that the work didn't suit him. Mercury poisoning, the doctor had said after Henri's collapse, likely from vapor exposure during an experiment gone wrong. But Henri had been nothing if not careful, trained by years of repetition to handle dangerous materials with respect. "You seem troubled, monsieur," the voice startled him. Anna Bergman, the governess, stood in the doorway with 2 young children, twins, by their matching faces and mismatched temperaments. One hiding behind her skirts, the other straining forward with curiosity. She was 31, he'd learned from kitchen gossip. Swiss from the canton of Bern, employed these past 2 months to tend the Baron's nephew's children during their extended visit. "Merely concentrating, mademoiselle," he replied, tucking the letter away. "The barometer requires precise attention." She approached with the children, her plain gray dress and severe hairstyle doing nothing to diminish the intelligence that animated her features. "The children are studying atmospheric pressure in their lessons. Might they observe briefly? From a safe distance, naturally." He noticed her hands, stained at the fingertips with what looked like silver nitrate, hastily scrubbed but not quite clean. Photographs, he thought, or perhaps chemistry experiments. Of course. Knowledge should never be denied to eager minds. As he explained the basic principles to the children, using simple words and gestures, he watched Anna from the corner of his eye. She followed his explanations with an intensity that suggested prior knowledge, occasionally nodding at points the children couldn't possibly grasp. When he mentioned the relationship between temperature and pressure, she absently murmured the equation under her breath. "You have scientific training, Mademoiselle Bergman?" Color rose in her cheeks. "My father was a village pharmacist. I assisted him before I required employment." The universal story of women of her class, education curtailed by economic necessity. The bolder twin piped up, "Mademoiselle Anna has a secret laboratory in the old conservatory. She shows us crystals growing and—" "Heinrich!" Anna's sharp tone cut him off. "We don't tell tales about private matters." But our craftsman had caught the boy's excitement, the genuine wonder that suggested truth. He filed this information away alongside his growing collection of house secrets. "Science requires space for experimentation," he said mildly. "I myself maintain several workspaces for different purposes." Their eyes met in brief understanding before the breakfast gong summoned the children away. Anna hurried them along, but not before casting one more glance at the barometer, her expression thoughtful. Alone again, he returned to his examination with renewed focus. Using his jeweler's loupe, he traced every centimeter of the glass tube, looking for imperfections, repairs, anything that might explain the anomalous readings. It was near the top, where the tube should be hermetically sealed to maintain the vacuum, that he found it. A joining so expertly done it was nearly invisible, where the original glass had been cut and extended with a matching piece. Modified, he wrote in his notebook. But why extend a barometer tube? The height of Mercury is determined by atmospheric pressure, not tube length. Unless the tube wasn't truly sealed at the top. Unless there was another opening, hidden, controlled. Finding anything interesting? Dr. Leclerc stood in the doorway, his medical bag in hand, suggesting he'd been visiting someone in the household. At 48, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who knew everyone's secrets and kept them for the right price. His interest in mesmerism and other borderline sciences had made him fashionable among those who could afford to indulge such interests. All instruments reveal their secrets eventually, Doctor. It's merely a matter of patience. Indeed, like the human body, I suppose. We all have our hidden mechanisms. Leclerc approached the barometer with obvious fascination. I've made a study of this remarkable device, you know. The correlation between its readings and family tensions is quite extraordinary. Almost as if it responds to human emotional atmosphere rather than the physical one. You're suggesting the barometer has supernatural properties? Not supernatural, merely not yet understood. Science advances daily. Who's to say what connections exist between human consciousness and the physical world? He smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. I've documented 17 instances where the mercury dropped before family conflicts. Statistical probability suggests this is beyond coincidence. Our craftsman considered this. And who typically observes these drops first? Oh, various people. Fouché, quite often. He checks it each morning. The Baroness, who's quite sensitive to such things. Sometimes Conrad, though he claims to disbelieve while watching it obsessively. The doctor paused. Your late apprentice was quite interested in my observations during his brief time here. The casual mention felt deliberate, probing. You knew Henri? Briefly. A thoughtful young man, very interested in the relationship between mechanical precision and human imprecision. His death was tragic. Mercury poisoning, wasn't it? An occupational hazard in your field, I suppose. There was something in the doctor's tone, a subtle emphasis that made our craftsman's neck prickle with unease. Before he could respond, a crash echoed from somewhere above, followed by raised voices. Conrad's voice, sharp with anger, then the Baroness, her French accent thickening with emotion. Both men looked automatically at the barometer. The mercury was falling, steadily, inexorably, like water draining from a bath. Remarkable, Leclerc murmured. It's happening again. But our craftsman was watching something else. A tiny bubble had appeared in the mercury column, rising slowly through the liquid metal. Impossible, he thought, unless air is entering the system somehow. He moved closer, studying the phenomenon with growing excitement. Air could only enter if the vacuum was compromised, and it could only be compromised if... I must continue my work, he said abruptly. These readings require documentation. Leclerc lingered a moment longer, then departed with a knowing smile that suggested he'd observed more than the barometer. Our craftsman waited until the footsteps faded, then quickly sketched what he'd seen. The bubble had disappeared now, absorbed back into the mercury, but its presence confirmed his growing suspicion. This wasn't just a barometer. It was a puppet, and somewhere in this house, someone was pulling its strings. The discovery came at 2 o'clock in the morning on October 10th, when the house lay wrapped in the peculiar silence that only comes to large estates in the small hours. Our craftsman had feigned retirement at the usual time, then waited in his room until the last servant's footsteps faded, before creeping back to the great hall with a bull's-eye lantern and his most delicate tools. The modified seal at the top of the barometer tube had been troubling him for days. Now, with proper light and solitude, he could investigate thoroughly. Standing on a ladder he'd quietly borrowed from the service corridor, he examined the junction where the original tube met its extension. There, nearly invisible even under magnification, was a hairline opening. Not a crack, but deliberately crafted, leading to what appeared to be a capillary tube no thicker than a horsehair. Brilliant, he thought grudgingly. Whoever did this understood both glassworking and pneumatics at a master's level. The capillary was embedded in the decorative molding that ran along the wall, painted to match perfectly. He traced its path with growing amazement, following it across 12 feet of wall, hidden in plain sight among the Baroque flourishes. The tube disappeared behind a portrait of some long-dead Hauser ancestor, a stern woman whose painted eyes seemed to follow his movements with disapproval. The portrait was hinged, another surprise, swinging open on well-oiled mechanisms to reveal that the capillary continued through a hole bored directly through the wall. The adjoining room was the Baron's study, locked at this hour, but no match for the simple picks any instrument maker carried for testing clock cases. Inside, by the filtered moonlight through tall windows, he could see the usual accumulation of a wealthy man's pretensions: leather-bound books never read, a globe never consulted, a desk that saw more brandy stains than ink. The capillary emerged from the wall behind a bookcase. Following it required moving several volumes of Rousseau that looked as if they'd never been opened, revealing a small panel that opened with pressure at just the right spot. Behind it sat an apparatus that made him catch his breath in professional admiration. It was a hand pump, beautifully crafted from brass and crystal, small enough to fit in a medical bag, yet precisely calibrated. A valve system allowed for either increasing or decreasing pressure in minute increments. Beside it, tucked into the hidden space, was a notebook filled with measurements and times. The handwriting was educated, careful, but he couldn't immediately identify it. October 3rd, he read by lantern light, 7:20 in the evening. Reduced pressure by 2 centimeters. Conrad argued with W about railway investments within the hour. September 15th, morning. Increased pressure despite falling external barometer. Family breakfast peaceful. M. commented on the pleasant surprise. Page after page of manipulation, someone playing the family's superstitions like a pianist playing scales. But why? What could someone gain from orchestrating conflicts and harmony? A floorboard creaked in the corridor. He quickly closed the panel, replaced the books, and slipped toward the door, but footsteps were already approaching. With nowhere to hide, he did the only thing possible, sat down at the Baron's desk, and placed his head in his hands as if he'd fallen asleep while working. "Monsieur?" It was Anna Bergman, holding a candle that cast dancing shadows across her face. She wore a dark cloak over her nightdress, and her feet were sensibly shod in felt slippers that explained why he'd heard her approach so late. He raised his head slowly, affecting confusion. "Mademoiselle, Forgive me. I was reviewing my calculations and must have dozed off. The Baron gave me permission to use his study for my mathematical work. Her eyes went to the bookshelf, then back to his face. At 2 in the morning? I find the mind clearest when the world sleeps. Fewer distractions from the vagaries of daytime pressure changes. He rose, gathering imaginary papers. But you're right, I should return to my room. And you, mademoiselle? Surely the children don't require instruction at this hour. I couldn't sleep. Sometimes I walk the halls. It's permitted. The Baroness understands that some of us are not built for normal hours. She paused, studying him with uncomfortable intensity. You've found something, haven't you? About the barometer? There are moments when one must decide whether to trust, and our craftsman had learned to read such moments like others read clocks. Anna Bergman was hiding something, certainly, but her concern seemed genuine. And he remembered the silver nitrate stains on her fingers, the boy's mention of a secret laboratory. What do you know of pneumatics, mademoiselle? More than a governess should? Less than I'd like? She moved closer, her voice dropping. I've been conducting experiments with vacuum pumps and pressure differentials. For my own education, you understand. Science shouldn't be denied to half of humanity simply because of their sex. And have you noticed anything unusual about the atmospheric pressure in this house? She smiled then, a conspirator's expression. You mean besides the fact that our famous barometer bears no relation to actual atmospheric conditions? Yes, monsieur. I've maintained my own measurements for 2 months. Would you like to see my data? He found himself following her through the sleeping house, up a narrow service stairway, to the abandoned conservatory on the 3rd floor. It had been glassed in once, a place for growing oranges and other exotic plants, but now served as storage for furniture no one wanted but couldn't bear to discard. Except in one corner, behind a Japanese screen, where Anna had created her sanctuary. It was a modest laboratory by any standard, but beautifully organized. A small mercury barometer of her own construction, chemical apparatus, notebooks filled with observations, and, surprisingly, a collection of glass tubes and pumps that looked very familiar. This equipment, he said slowly, where did you acquire it? Your apprentice sold it to me. Henri, wasn't it? 3 months ago, just before he left the estate. He said he had no more use for it, that his experiments here had failed. She pulled out a notebook. He was investigating something about the house barometer, but he was secretive about his conclusions. Then came news of his death, and she trailed off, but he could fill in the rest. She'd continued Henri's work, trying to understand what had troubled the young man enough to abandon his position. Look at this, she said, opening her notebook to a chart. I've tracked the barometer readings against actual atmospheric pressure for 8 weeks. But more importantly, I've tracked them against family events. Someone is definitely manipulating the device, but the pattern suggests they're not causing conflicts. They're trying to prevent them. Our craftsman studied her data, his mind racing. Prevent them? See here. Whenever Conrad grows agitated about money, the pressure drops dramatically. The family assumes an argument is coming and actively works to avoid it. The Baroness sends Conrad to town, or the Baron retreats to his club. The conflict is diffused. But that would mean that someone is using the barometer to manage the family dynamics, to control them through their own superstitions. She met his eyes. The question is whether they're doing it for good or ill. He thought of the hidden pump in the Baron's study, the careful notebook of manipulations. There's something you should see, he said finally,
and led her back through the dark house to show her what he'd found. Her reaction to the hidden mechanism was equal parts admiration and horror. "This is masterful work. But who? Who has the knowledge and the access?" "That," our craftsman said quietly, studying the apparatus in the lamplight, "is what we must discover before this puppet show turns tragic." The letter from Henri's mother haunted our craftsman through the following days. On October 12th, unable to concentrate on his systematic examination of the barometer, he decided to visit Madame Dumont during the household's afternoon rest period. He borrowed a small rowboat from the estate's dock, telling Fouché he needed to collect specialized tools from Geneva, though the butler's expression suggested he suspected otherwise.
Madame Dumont lived above a bakery in Carouge, her apartment accessible by stairs that reeked of yeast and poverty in equal measure. She'd aged considerably since Henri's funeral, her black mourning dress hanging loose on a frame that had forgotten the purpose of eating. When she handed him Henri's papers, her hands trembled like leaves anticipating autumn's end. "I found these hidden in his tool case, wrapped in oilcloth," she explained, setting out thin tea in chipped cups. "Henri was always drawing, even as a child, but these frighten me." The drawings were meticulous, showing the Villa Montrose barometer from every angle, with measurements precise to the millimeter. But it was Henri's notes that made our craftsman's blood run cold. "The mercury rises where it shouldn't," Henri had written. "Not in the tube, but in the workshop. Found drops on the bench, the floor. Someone is spilling it deliberately. Why?" Another page, dated 2 weeks before his death, followed F. "Tonight, he carries a vial, deposits drops in specific locations. The young master's study, near the governess's room. Pattern unclear. Mercury vapor is toxic. Must warn someone, but who would believe?" F, thought our craftsman. Fouché? It seemed impossible that the dignified butler would engage in such dangerous behavior. Yet, hadn't he noticed the man's peculiar relationship with the barometer, the way he avoided looking at it directly? "Madam," he said gently, "did Henri ever mention feeling unwell while at the estate? Headaches, trembling hands, confusion?" "Yes, yes. He complained of terrible headaches his last week there, said the house itself was poisoned. I thought it was merely his poetic way of describing the atmosphere." Her voice broke. "I should have listened more carefully." He comforted her as best he could, promising to investigate fully, then rowed back across the darkening lake with his mind churning like storm waters. Mercury vapor poisoning was insidious, cumulative. Small amounts over time could cause tremors, personality changes, eventual madness, or death. If someone had been deliberately exposing Henri to mercury, the estate was preparing for dinner when he returned, the great house glowing with gaslight like a lantern against the October dusk. He went straight to Anna's conservatory laboratory, where he found her teaching the twins to crystallize salt solutions. "Children, run along to wash for dinner," she told them, recognizing his expression. When they'd gone, she turned to him urgently. "What have you learned?" He showed her Henri's notes, watching her face pale as she read. "This is monstrous," she whispered. "To deliberately poison someone." "We need to test for mercury vapor in various rooms. Can you prepare detection papers? Silver nitrate should react with mercury vapor to produce a color change." "Yes, I have the materials." She was already moving to her chemical supplies. But if someone is doing this deliberately, we're also in danger. Which is why we work carefully and trust no one else yet." He paused, studying her determined face. "Why did Henri trust you enough to sell you his equipment?" She colored slightly. "He said I reminded him of someone. A sister, perhaps? He seemed lonely, isolated. The other servants avoided him after he started asking questions about the barometer." She looked up from measuring chemicals. "He was trying to protect them, wasn't he? Trying to discover who was spreading poison?" Before he could answer, young Ernst Hauser appeared in the doorway, his artistic soul apparent in his disheveled appearance and ink-stained fingers. At 19, he had the unfocused intensity of someone who'd rather be anywhere but where family duty placed him. "Anna, oh, pardon me." He noticed our craftsman and reddened. "I didn't realize you were occupied." "Ernst?" Anna's tone was carefully neutral, but our craftsman caught the undercurrent, something between affection and resignation. "Did you need something?" That is, Mother wishes to know if you'll join us for dinner. Both of you, actually. She insists the instrument maker must tell us about his progress." He looked between them with an expression that suggested he'd rather be discussing poetry than relaying maternal commands. "She's in one of her moods. The barometer dropped again this afternoon." Our craftsmen exchanged glances with Anna. They'd both checked their own instruments. The actual atmospheric pressure had been rising steadily all day. Someone had manipulated the house barometer again. But why now? At dinner, the reason became apparent. Conrad was holding forth about a new investment opportunity, some scheme involving importing American cotton through Swiss banks to circumvent embargo restrictions. His mother, the Baroness, sat rigid with disapproval, her French accent sharpening with each carefully chosen word of opposition. The Baron looked exhausted, a man caught between wife and son like a clock pendulum that had lost its rhythm. "The barometer warns us," the Baroness said pointedly, "that storms approach when we act rashly." Conrad laughed bitterly. "The barometer is a fraud, Mother. We all know it, even if we pretend otherwise." "Conrad," Isabel interjected, "how can you say such things?" "Because I'm not blind, dear sister. Our instrument maker here has been prowling the house for over a week. Do you think he'd need so long for simple maintenance?" He turned his sharp gaze on our craftsman. "Tell us, sir, what have you found?" The room fell silent, even the servants freezing mid-motion. Our craftsman set down his soup spoon carefully, aware that his next words would shift the household's delicate balance. "I've found," he said slowly, "that your barometer is a remarkably complex instrument, far more complex than simple atmospheric measurement would require." "Meaning?" the Baron asked weakly. "Meaning that someone with considerable skill modified it years ago. The question is whether that modification was meant to help or harm this family." Dr. Leclerc, who'd been dining with them, as was his frequent custom, leaned forward with interest. "You're suggesting deliberate tampering?" "I'm suggesting that nothing in this house is quite what it seems." He looked directly at Fouché, who stood by the sideboard. "Including who might have access to certain mechanisms." The butler's composure never wavered, but our craftsman caught the minute tightening around his eyes. The Baroness, however, had gone pale as fresh cream. "Perhaps," she said with forced lightness, "we should discuss such matters after dinner." The children are present. The twins, who'd been following the conversation with the acute attention children reserve for adult discord, were hastily dismissed with their governess.
Anna rose to leave, but not before catching our craftsman's eye with a look that said their investigation would continue regardless of family sensibilities. As the dinner progressed in stilted conversation about safer topics, our craftsman noticed something else. Dr. Leclerc kept touching his vest pocket, where the outline of a small vial was barely visible. When the doctor reached for the salt, his cuff pulled back slightly, revealing skin marked with the telltale gray discoloration of chronic mercury exposure. The poisoner, he realized with cold certainty, has been poisoning himself as well. The confrontation came sooner than expected. That very evening, as our craftsman prepared his detection papers in the privacy of his room, Dr. Leclerc knocked on his door.
The physician entered without waiting for permission, closing the door behind him with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to taking liberties in this house. "You know," Leclerc said without preamble, settling into the room's single chair as if he owned it, "about the mercury. I saw your recognition at dinner." Our craftsman continued preparing his chemicals, keeping his hands steady despite his racing pulse. "I know that someone has been distributing mercury throughout this house. I know that my apprentice died investigating it. What I don't know is why a physician sworn to do no harm would engage in such practices." Leclerc laughed, a sound like water over stones. "Do no harm? My dear fellow, I've prevented more harm in this house than you could imagine. Tell me, what do you know of Conrad's true nature?" "He's troubled. Gambling debts, from what I gather." "Troubled?" The doctor repeated the word as if tasting wine gone sour. "Conrad Hauser is violent when opposed. 3 years ago, he struck a servant so severely the man lost hearing in one ear. The family paid for silence, of course. Last year, in a rage over a denied loan, he pushed his mother down the stairs. She claimed she tripped, but I treated the bruises shaped like fingers on her arms." The doctor pulled out his vial, holding it to the lamplight, where the mercury gleamed like captured moonlight. "Small doses of mercury vapor cause confusion, lethargy, docility. I've been treating Conrad's violent episodes for 2 years now, carefully controlling his exposure. The headaches and tremors he attributes to too much wine. The family has had peace. You've been poisoning him. I've been sedating him. No different than laudanum or chloral hydrate, but more subtle. The family never needs to know their son requires chemical restraint." Leclerc's eyes glittered with the fervor of a man who justified his actions too many times. "Your apprentice threatened to expose everything. I tried to reason with him, but he was young, idealistic. He didn't understand that sometimes the greater good requires distasteful methods. So you killed him. I increased his exposure to encourage him to leave. I never meant for him to die. He must have been more sensitive than anticipated. Or perhaps he encountered additional mercury in his own workshop. These things compound, you understand." Our craftsman felt rage building in his chest like steam in a boiler, but he kept his voice level. "And the barometer? Are you behind that manipulation as well?" "The barometer?" Leclerc looked genuinely puzzled. "I assumed that was your discovery to make. I've always found it amusing, the family's superstition about it, but I have no knowledge of its mechanism. My concern has been purely medical." Before our craftsman could respond, footsteps thundered in the corridor. The door burst open, revealing Conrad himself, wild-eyed and breathing heavily. "You!" he pointed at Leclerc. "I heard everything. You've been poisoning me." The scene erupted into chaos. Conrad lunged at the doctor, who tried to retreat but found himself trapped against the window. Our craftsman attempted to intervene, but Conrad's rage gave him terrible strength. In the struggle, the mercury vial shattered against the floor, its contents spreading in perfect silver beads across the wood. "Stop!" Anna's voice cut through the violence. She stood in the doorway with Fouché and the Baron, all drawn by the commotion. "Everyone out of this room immediately! That mercury vapor is dangerous to all of us!" The authority in her voice broke through Conrad's fury. As they evacuated to the corridor, our craftsman noticed Fouché staring at the spilled mercury with an expression of profound understanding, as if pieces of a puzzle had suddenly aligned in his mind. In the Baron's study, the truth unfolded in layers. Leclerc, under threat of prosecution, confessed his entire scheme. Conrad, shaking with rage and mercury-induced tremors, had to be physically restrained from attacking the doctor again. The Baron sat behind his desk, aging years in minutes, as he absorbed the reality of what had been happening in his own home. "But who," Isabel asked, having joined them despite her parents' protests, "has been manipulating the barometer? If not Dr. Leclerc, then who?" All eyes turned to our craftsman. He walked to the bookshelf, pressing the hidden panel he'd discovered days earlier. The mechanism revealed itself, and gasps echoed through the room. But it was Fouché who stepped forward, his dignity intact despite what he was about to reveal. "It was I," the butler said simply, "though not alone, and not for the reasons you might suppose." The Baroness made a small sound, her hand flying to her throat. Fouché continued, his voice steady as always. "Madame approached me 3 years ago, after Conrad's first violent episode. She knew her son was dangerous, but couldn't bear to have him institutionalized. We devised the Barometer scheme together. I would manipulate it to predict conflicts, allowing the family to separate before violence could occur." "Marguerite?" The Baron's voice was hollow. "You've been orchestrating our lives?" "I've been protecting our family," she replied, steel beneath her French softness. "Conrad needed help, but refused to acknowledge it. The barometer gave us a way to manage his moods without confrontation. When everyone believed the instrument predicted trouble, they naturally avoided each other during dangerous times." "And you never thought to tell me?" The Baron's hurt was palpable. "You would have insisted on honesty, on facing things directly. You're Swiss, my dear. You believe all problems can be solved with democracy and discussion. But some problems require subterfuge." Conrad laughed bitterly from his chair. "So I'm the monster everyone's been managing." "The mad dog to be carefully handled." "You're our son," the Baroness said firmly, "and you're ill. The violence, the gambling, the rage, these are symptoms, not character. We protected you the only way we knew how." Our craftsman watched this family drama unfold with the detachment of someone paid to observe rather than judge. Yet he felt a profound sadness for all of them. The mother desperate to protect, the father kept ignorant in his own home, the son whose illness had shaped everyone's reality, the daughter learning that her family's foundation was built on elaborate deception. "What of Henri?" he asked quietly. "Did he discover your scheme?" Fouché nodded slowly. "He was too clever, too observant. He found the mechanism within days. I tried to convince him to stay quiet, even offered him money, but he insisted the truth must be revealed. When he began falling ill, I suspected Dr. Leclerc was involved, but I had no proof, and speaking out would have exposed our own deception.
So everyone was protecting everyone else with lies, Ernst said from the doorway where he'd been listening. And in the end, the lies became more dangerous than the truth would have been. Anna stood beside him, her hand briefly touching his arm in comfort. Our craftsman noticed the gesture, the easy intimacy of it, and understood that here, too, was another secret, another relationship constrained by social boundaries and family expectations. "The question now," our craftsman said, addressing the room, "is what to do with all these truths. The barometer can be restored to its original function. Dr. Leclerc must face justice for Henri's death, and Conrad needs proper medical treatment, not poisoning or manipulation." The Baron rose slowly, seeming to gather authority like a cloak around his shoulders. "Yes," he said simply. "We will face the truth, however painful. It seems the barometer's greatest prediction was that secrets, like mercury, are poison when they escape their containers." The October rain that had threatened for days finally arrived on the 21st, turning the lake gray as old pewter and confining everyone to the house. Our craftsman used this enforced proximity to set his trap, though he took no pleasure in the deception required. Sometimes he reflected, while adjusting his instruments in the great hall, one must use the enemy's weapons against them. He'd spent the morning visibly working on the barometer, making a show of his repairs while actually doing nothing more than cleaning already pristine glass. The real work had been completed in secret the night before. He'd installed a small telltale, a hidden gauge that would record any pressure changes in the capillary system. Whoever next attempted to manipulate the barometer would leave evidence as clear as fingerprints on polished brass. Anna assisted him, having been officially requisitioned from her governess duties to help with the delicate scientific work. In truth, he valued her sharp mind and steadying presence as the house's atmosphere grew increasingly strained. Dr. Leclerc remained under informal house arrest in his guest room, awaiting the authorities who would arrive once the weather cleared. Conrad had locked himself in his chambers, refusing all visitors except Fouché, who brought him meals and endured his bitter recriminations with characteristic stoicism. "The mercury's steady," Anna observed, checking her own portable barometer. 29.8 inches. "The real storm is inside these walls." She was right. The family moved through the house like chess pieces, avoiding capture, each careful not to occupy the same space as another. Only Isabel seemed to navigate freely, her scientific curiosity apparently stronger than her emotional distress. She joined them now, carrying a tray of tea that suggested an excuse rather than genuine hospitality. "I've been thinking," she said without preamble, setting down the tray with a rattle that betrayed her nerves, "about the patterns. Mother and Fouché couldn't have been the only ones manipulating the barometer. The timing doesn't align." Our craftsman paused in his work. He'd been wondering when someone would notice this discrepancy. "Explain." "Here," she pulled out a small notebook, her own record of the barometer's predictions. "Mother was in Lyon for 2 weeks in September, visiting her sister. Fouché accompanied her. Father insisted, worried about railway strikes. Yet the barometer predicted 3 family conflicts during their absence, and it was correct each time." Anna leaned over to study the notebook. "Someone else knew about the mechanism." "Or discovered it independently," our craftsman suggested, though his pulse quickened. His trap might catch more than one quarry. That afternoon, while the family gathered for the enforced togetherness of tea, he made his announcement.
The barometer is repaired. It will now function as originally intended, a true measure of atmospheric pressure, nothing more. Thank God, the Baron muttered, though he looked somehow diminished, as if the loss of even a false prophet left him more vulnerable to life's uncertainties. However, our craftsman continued, I've installed a new mechanism, a security measure, you might say. Any attempt to tamper with it will be immediately apparent. He watched their faces carefully. The Baroness remained impassive, having already confessed her part. Fouché stood statue still by the door, but Ernst, young, artistic Ernst, shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to Anna, then away.
That night, our craftsman didn't pretend to sleep. He positioned himself in an alcove where he could observe the Great Hall while remaining hidden. Anna waited in the conservatory, ready to block any escape through the servants' stairs. They'd agreed on 3 o'clock as their cutoff. If nothing happened by then, they'd try again the next night. At 2:37, a figure crept into the hall. Not Fouché, not the Baroness, not even Conrad seeking revenge on the instrument of his manipulation. It was Ernst, moving with surprising stealth for someone who typically drifted through life in an artistic haze. He went not to the barometer, but to a different spot on the wall, pressing a section of molding our craftsman hadn't previously examined. Another panel opened. Another capillary tube led to another hidden pump. 2 systems our craftsman realized with professional admiration. 2 separate manipulations running parallel. No wonder the patterns hadn't matched. The house had been playing host to competing puppet masters. Ernst worked quickly, adjusting his mechanism to create a slight rise in the mercury. As he did, he whispered to himself, or perhaps to the barometer, the way lonely people talk to mirrors, just enough to ensure a peaceful breakfast. Just enough to let Anna and me have one morning without suspicion. Our craftsman stepped from his hiding place. Ernst spun around, nearly dropping the small pump he held. For a moment, they faced each other in the dim light, the older man who fixed instruments and the younger who'd learned to fix situations. How long? Our craftsman asked simply. Ernst's shoulders sagged. 6 months. I found the second system by accident. I was looking for a quiet place to write, somewhere Father wouldn't find me. The previous owner must have installed it. The equipment is older than Mother's modification. His laugh held no humor. I thought I was so clever, using it to create peaceful moments when Anna and I could talk without scrutiny. Small manipulations, nothing like Mother's grand orchestrations. You were protecting your relationship with her. I was trying to. But protection through deception seems to be the Hauser family tradition, doesn't it? Ernst's bitterness rivaled his brother's. We're all puppeteers here, pulling strings to make others dance the way we want. Anna appeared in the doorway, having heard enough. Her expression was unreadable in the darkness. Ernst, you manipulated the barometer to court me? No. Well, yes, but... He struggled for words. I used it to create opportunities. Moments when the family would be distracted by good weather and good moods. When no one would notice if we talked about books or science or dreams that have nothing to do with this suffocating house. She approached slowly, and our craftsman recognized his cue to withdraw slightly, though he remained within earshot. These young people deserved a moment of privacy, even if it was just another illusion in a house built on them. You could have simply talked to me, Anna said quietly. I'm a governess, not a princess in a tower. Could I? You've seen how Mother reacts to any suggestion of impropriety.
One hint of attachment between us and you'd be dismissed without reference. I couldn't bear to cost you your position. So instead you chose to deceive everyone, including me. Ernst had no answer to that, and in his silence lay the weight of every good intention that paved a path to deception.
Our craftsman thought of his dead apprentice, of Madame Dumont's tears, of all the harm that had sprouted from seeds of protection and care. "I think," our craftsman said, stepping forward again, "that this family needs to learn to live without prophecies, false or otherwise. Tomorrow, I'll dismantle both systems completely. The barometer will be just a barometer. You'll have to navigate your conflicts and connections without mechanical intervention." Ernst nodded miserably. Anna remained silent, her face a study in conflicted emotions. As they dispersed to their respective rooms, our craftsman remained in the hall, looking up at the towering barometer. In the lamplight, the mercury seemed to pulse like a living thing, as if it had developed its own consciousness through years of being used to shape human behavior. He pulled out his notebook and wrote, October 22nd, discovery of second manipulation system. The house contains not one puppet master, but a hierarchy of them, each pulling strings, unaware of the others. Mercury, at true pressure, 29.8 inches. Family pressure, immeasurable. The rain continued through the night, tapping against windows like fingers drumming with impatience. By morning, our craftsman knew he would have to report Ernst's discovery to the Baron. Another revelation in a week of them, another secret stripped away like old varnish from wood. The family would survive. Families usually did. But they would be different, forced to face each other without the comfortable buffer of mechanical prediction. Perhaps, he thought, climbing the stairs to his room, that's the true repair this house needs. The morning of October 26th arrived with unseasonable warmth, the kind of false summer that Lake Geneva sometimes granted before winter's final conquest. Our craftsman found the Baroness alone in the morning room, her breakfast untouched, studying documents that looked suspiciously like financial ledgers. She'd aged in the days since the revelations began, her careful composure cracking like old porcelain. "I owe you an apology," she said without looking up, "and compensation for your apprentice's family. It was my deception that created the environment where such tragedy could occur." He sat without invitation. At this point, formal protocols seemed absurd. Your deception, Dr. Leclerc's poisoning, Ernst's manipulation, the previous owner's original modification. How many layers of lies can one instrument support? All of them, apparently. She finally met his eyes. I've been reviewing our finances. Conrad's gambling debts are worse than we knew. He's been borrowing against his inheritance, using forged documents. The estate itself is at risk. Will you tell the Baron? I have to, don't I? That's what we're doing now, telling truths, no matter how they hurt. She laughed, brittle as dried leaves. Do you know what's ironic? The barometer actually did predict family conflicts. Not through supernatural means, but because we all watched it so carefully that we created the very tensions we sought to avoid. We became slaves to our own oracle. Before he could respond, Fouché appeared with his usual silent efficiency. Madam, there's a visitor. Jakob Müller from Geneva. He says he has urgent business with our instrument maker. Our craftsman felt his stomach tighten. Jakob's arrival could only mean trouble.
either for the observatory contract they both coveted or something worse. He found his old rival in the Great Hall, studying the barometer with professional interest. "Magnificent work," Jakob said by way of greeting. "I can see why you've spent so long here, though I wonder if you know the full story of this instrument." "Meaning?" Jakob pulled out a leather portfolio.
After you left so abruptly, I was curious. I researched the estate's history, particularly the previous owner who installed this barometer. Baron Torelli, an Italian émigré with a fascination for natural philosophy and the occult. He died quite suddenly 5 years ago, just weeks after the Hausers purchased the estate. Natural causes? Mercury poisoning. Jacob let that settle. The authorities assumed it was accidental, exposure from his experiments. But given what's happened here since... Our craftsman studied the documents Jacob had brought. Purchase records, death certificates, correspondence. A pattern emerged, one that made his hands cold despite the warm morning. Torelli installed the first manipulation system. He was using it for his own purposes, then tried the same trick on the Hausers during negotiations. Exactly. Created artificial tensions to lower the purchase price. But someone discovered his scheme. Jacob's expression was grave. Someone who knew about Mercury's toxic properties and had access to his private laboratory. They both turned to look at Fouché, who stood perfectly still by the doorway. The butler's face revealed nothing, but our craftsman remembered Henri's notes. F. carries a vial. Monsieur Fouché, our craftsman said carefully, you were with the family when they purchased this estate, weren't you? I've served the Hausers for 20 years, through 3 residences. His tone remained level, professional. Baron Torelli was an unpleasant man who tried to cheat my employers. His death was fortunate timing, nothing more. And the mercury Henri observed you distributing. For the first time since our craftsman's arrival, Fouché's composure cracked slightly. That was a different matter. After discovering Torelli's manipulation system, I studied his notes on Mercury's properties. Small amounts, strategically placed, can reveal themselves through tarnishing of silver, discoloration of gold. I was marking locations where valuables had been hidden, all replaced with forgeries. The previous owner had been substituting fake artwork for real pieces. I was protecting the family's investment. By using the same poison that killed Torelli, I used what was available. The estate came with a fully equipped laboratory. It seemed efficient. Fouché's jaw tightened. I never meant for anyone to be harmed. The amounts I used were minuscule, meant only to mark, not poison. Your apprentice's death was Dr. Leclerc's doing, not mine. The web of deceptions grew ever more tangled. Our craftsman felt like a clockmaker trying to repair a mechanism where every gear connected to 3 others in ways that defied conventional mechanics. Yet somewhere in this mess was the truth, not clean, not simple, but truth nonetheless. We need to tell the authorities everything, Jacob said, about Torelli, about the doctor, about all of it. Do we? The Baroness had entered silently, Ernst and Isabel flanking her. What purpose would that serve? Torelli is dead, whether by accident or design. Dr. Leclerc will face justice for Henri. Destroying our family's reputation won't bring anyone back. It would bring truth, our craftsman said firmly. Your husband deserves to know everything. The authorities deserve to investigate properly. And Henri's mother deserves to know her son died trying to protect others from a danger he'd discovered. The argument that followed was quiet but intense.
each family member weighing preservation against revelation. Conrad appeared, drawn by the voices, looking haggard but more lucid than he'd been in days, the absence of Mercury's influence already showing. Even Anna joined them. The twins she was supposed to be teaching left with the cook.
Finally, the Baron himself entered, supported by Dr. Leclerc and a uniformed gendarme. The doctor was in custody, but had been permitted to assist the Baron, who'd suffered what appeared to be a mild heart episode during the night. "Enough," the Baron said weakly but with authority. "I've heard everything through the walls. These Swiss houses, they're built solid but sound travels. I know about Torelli. I know about the poisonings. I know about the manipulations. All of them." He looked at each family member in turn. "What I don't know is whether we can survive as a family if we continue valuing appearance over truth." He turned to our craftsman. "You've been our confessor as much as our repairman. What would you advise?" Our craftsman considered carefully. He thought of Henri, dying for truth, of the Baroness lying for love, of Fouché protecting through deception, of Ernst and Anna trying to build something real on a foundation of falsehood. "I would advise," he said slowly, "that you dismantle everything false in this house, starting with the Barometer's hidden mechanisms. Face whatever comes, debt, scandal, judgment. Truth may be harsh, but it doesn't compound like mercury in the body, growing more toxic over time." The Baron nodded slowly. "Then we start today. Fouché, summon our lawyer. We'll make a full report to the authorities. Conrad, you'll present a complete accounting of your debts. Marguerite, no more secret schemes. And Ernst," he looked at his younger son with unexpected gentleness, "if you care for Mademoiselle Bergman, court her properly. No more mechanical assistance." As the family dispersed to begin their painful journey toward honesty, Jakob approached our craftsman. "That was well done, though it may have cost you their recommendation for the observatory contract." "Perhaps, but I can sleep soundly knowing I've repaired more than just their barometer." He paused, then extended his hand. "The contract should go to whoever's best qualified. May the better craftsman win." Jacob shook his hand firmly. "Already you've won something more valuable. You've shown that truth, like a properly calibrated instrument, serves its purpose best when it measures accurately, regardless of whether we like what it reveals." November's arrival brought lawyers and policemen to Villa Montrose, their black carriages marking the gravel drive like a funeral procession. Our craftsmen spent these days completing the meticulous work of truly repairing the barometer, removing both hidden systems, sealing the capillaries, restoring the instrument to its original, honest function. The work was straightforward now, purely mechanical, a relief after weeks of human complexity. On November 3rd, while carefully extracting the last of the hidden tubing from inside the walls, Anna found him in the Great Hall. She carried a leather satchel and wore traveling clothes, her governess uniform replaced by a practical brown dress that suggested a woman preparing for a different life. "I've been dismissed," she said without bitterness. The Baroness was kind about it. A full year's wages as severance and a glowing reference. But the twins' parents are taking them home early, given the scandal. He paused in his work, studying her face. And Ernst? Has surprised everyone, including himself. He's entered into negotiations with his father about studying engineering at the Polytechnic here in Zurich. Says he wants to understand how things truly work, not just how they appear to work. She smiled slightly. "We've agreed to correspond, properly.
with his parents' knowledge. A good foundation for whatever might develop. Yes, though I won't be waiting idly. She set down her satchel and pulled out a familiar notebook, Henri's journal, which his mother had given her.
I've been corresponding with Madame Dumont. She's agreed to let me study Henri's notes properly, to compile them into something useful. A warning, perhaps, about the dangers of mercury in scientific work. Our craftsman felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the morning sunshine streaming through the windows. Henri would have appreciated that. He was always concerned about other craftsmen's safety. There's more. She hesitated, then continued with determination. Your friend Jacob mentioned you might need an assistant at your workshop. Someone with steady hands and an understanding of chemical processes. Did he now? Our craftsman considered this. Jacob had indeed visited again yesterday, bringing news that they would share the observatory contract. The committee had decided 2 perspectives were better than 1 for such crucial work. I suppose I could use help, especially with someone willing to learn properly, not just rush through for quick profit. Before Anna could respond, Conrad entered the hall. He looked different, still sharp-featured, still carrying himself with aristocratic bearing, but something fundamental had changed. The constant agitation that had marked his movements was gone, replaced by a steadiness that might have been resignation or might have been relief. I wanted to speak with you before you left, he said to our craftsman, to apologize, not just for my behavior during your stay, but for everything. The gambling, the violence, the fear I created that made everyone feel they needed to manage me like a wild animal. You were ill. Mercury poisoning affects the mind as much as the body, perhaps. But I made choices before the mercury, choices that led my mother to believe such measures were necessary. He looked at the barometer, now standing simple and honest in its restored state. I've agreed to enter a sanitarium in Lausanne, for the gambling addiction primarily, but also to learn how to be different, better. That takes courage, our craftsman said, meaning it. Conrad laughed, short but genuine, or desperation. The estate is saved, barely. Father had to sell his railway shares and will be letting most of the staff go. We'll be keeping only Fouché. Despite everything, he's proven his loyalty, even if his methods were questionable. He paused. The authorities have decided not to pursue charges regarding Torelli's death. Insufficient evidence, they say, though I think they simply prefer not to disturb old graves. The rest of the day passed in a blur of final adjustments and farewells. The Baron, still weak but recovering, shook our craftsman's hand with genuine gratitude. You've saved us more than you know. Not from poverty or scandal, those will endure, but from continuing to live in a false paradise maintained by lies. The Baroness presented him with his payment, generous as promised, plus an additional sum. For Henri's mother, she said quietly. It won't bring him back, but perhaps it will ease her circumstances. Isabel gifted him a book, a first edition of Galileo's Dialogue Concerning Two Sciences. For someone who understands that science serves truth, not convenience, she said. Even Fouché, maintaining his dignity despite his ambiguous position, offered something, a small barometer of exquisite craftsmanship. From Baron Torelli's collection, one of the few pieces that was never modified or corrupted. May it serve you better than our larger one served us. Dr. Leclerc had already been taken to Geneva to await trial. He'd maintained his innocence regarding intent to kill,
insisting Henri's death was an unfortunate accident.
The courts would decide, though our craftsman suspected the doctor's medical knowledge would work against him. He knew too much about Mercury's effects to claim ignorance. As evening approached on November 5th, our craftsman supervised the loading of his tools onto the boat that would carry him home. Anna would travel with him, having accepted the position as his assistant. They would stop first at Madame Dumont's to deliver the money and the news that her son's death had not been in vain. His discoveries had prevented further tragedy. The barometer stood magnificent in the fading light, its mercury column showing exactly 30.1 inches, high pressure, predicting fair weather ahead. For the first time since our craftsman's arrival, its reading was simply true. No hidden mechanisms or manipulations, just the weight of air measured against the weight of mercury. "Will they manage?" Anna asked, looking back at the house as their boat pulled away from the dock. "Without their profit, without their systems of control? They'll have to learn," our craftsman replied, watching the estate recede into dusk. "Like resetting a clock that's been running fast for years. At first, the correct time seems wrong, but eventually, they'll adjust to reality." The boat moved steadily across the calm lake, and our craftsman found himself thinking about instruments and truth, about the human desire to control the uncontrollable. The Hausers had tried to use mechanical prediction to manage human nature, forgetting that people, unlike barometers, don't respond predictably to pressure. Perhaps, he thought, watching Anna make notes in her notebook, already beginning her compilation of Henri's work, the real lesson is that some things shouldn't be measured at all. Love, trust, family bonds, these operate outside the realm of scientific instrumentation. As the lights of Geneva appeared ahead, he pulled out his own notebook and made a final entry about Villa Montrose. November 5th. Barometer restored to original function. Family beginning process of recalibration. Weather fair. Forecast uncertain, as all honest forecasts must be. Jacob met them at the dock, eager to hear the full story and to show them the preliminary plans for the observatory instruments. "You'll appreciate this," he said to our craftsman. "They want redundancy in every measurement. No single instrument's reading will be taken as absolute truth." "Wise," our craftsman replied. "Truth is best confirmed from multiple sources." As they walked toward his workshop, Anna carrying Henri's notes, Jacob discussing technical specifications, our craftsman felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of completion that had nothing to do with finishing a job. The Hauser family would struggle, certainly, but they would struggle honestly. Henri's death would have meaning through Anna's work, and his own workshop would be enlivened by new perspectives and fresh energy. The workshop on November 6th smelled of brass polish and coffee. Anna had installed a small spirit stove in the corner, declaring that scientific work required proper fuel. Our craftsman sat at his primary workbench, crafting a new barometer commissioned by the university, while Anna worked at Henri's old station, carefully cataloging his notes into a systematic warning about Mercury's dangers. The morning light through the tall windows caught the glass tubes and metal instruments, turning the workshop into a cathedral of precision. Yet our craftsman found his mind wandering to Villa Montrose, to the family trying to navigate without their mechanical prophet. A letter had arrived at dawn. Ernst's careful script reporting that Conrad had entered the sanitarium, that the Baron's health was improving, that the estate would survive, though diminished. "Strange, isn't it?" Anna said,
not looking up from her work, how we trust instruments more than our own judgment. As if a tube of mercury knows more about the world than we do. Perhaps because instruments don't lie, he replied, adjusting the scale on his new barometer. They may be wrong if poorly calibrated, but they don't deliberately deceive. Unlike people. She set down her pen, stretching fingers cramped from writing. Though I wonder if the Hausers' deceptions weren't a kind of truth. They revealed what each person feared most. Conrad feared his own violence. The Baroness feared losing her family. Ernst feared rejection. Our craftsman considered this while testing the barometer's vacuum seal. The mercury rose and fell obediently with the slightest pressure changes, honest as sunlight. Fear makes us create elaborate mechanisms to avoid simple truths.
The Hausers built a complex system of prediction and manipulation, when simple conversation might have served better. A knock at the door interrupted their philosophical discussion. Jacob entered, followed surprisingly by young Thomas, Anna's 12-year-old brother, whom she'd mentioned in passing. The boy's eyes widened at the workshop's array of instruments, the same wonder our craftsman remembered from his own first encounter with precision mechanics 40 years ago. "Thomas has been pestering me," Jacob said with good humor. "Says his sister promised he could learn the trade. I thought perhaps between the three of us, we might manage one more apprentice." Anna rose quickly, embracing her brother with obvious joy. "Mother agreed? But the cost is manageable, given your new position," Jacob interrupted. "Besides, the observatory contract will require all available hands. The boy might as well learn properly from the start." Our craftsman studied Thomas, thin but steady-handed, with the kind of focused attention that suggested natural aptitude. "Can you read a thermometer, boy?" "Yes, sir, and a compass, and I've been practicing with Anna's calculations." "Then you can start by cleaning the secondary workbench. A craftsman respects his tools and workspace above all else." As Thomas eagerly set to work, our craftsman felt the workshop shifting into a new rhythm. Where once he'd worked in solitary precision, now there was conversation, teaching, the passing on of knowledge that Henri's death had interrupted. The ghost of his former apprentice seemed to approve, or perhaps that was just the November wind rattling the windows. By afternoon, they'd settled into productive work. Thomas proved quick to learn. Anna divided her time between Henri's notes and assisting with delicate adjustments. And Jacob came and went, bringing news from other workshops and updates on the observatory project. The barometer for the university took shape under our craftsman's hands, each component crafted with the care of someone who'd learned that even honest instruments could be made to lie. "Tell me," Anna said during their afternoon break, "do you regret taking the Montrose commission, given everything that happened?" Our craftsman considered while measuring mercury into the new barometer's reservoir. Exactly the right amount, no more, no less. "Regret suggests I'd choose differently given another chance. But Henri was already dead. The Hausers were already trapped in their deceptions, and the truth was already poisoning them slowly. At least by going, some good came from tragedy." "The truth as medicine rather than poison," Anna mused. "Though the dose makes the difference, doesn't it? Too much truth at once and the patient dies of shock. Which is why we revealed it gradually, one mechanism at a time." He sealed the barometer's reservoir, watching the mercury find its level. The Hausers had time to adjust to each revelation before the next. Thomas looked up from polishing brass fittings. "Is that why you didn't expose everything immediately? Kindness?" Our craftsman smiled slightly. The boy was perceptive. Kindness hidden behind pragmatism. A family destroyed entirely serves no one. A family rebuilt on truth might yet serve some purpose. As evening approached, he stood back to examine the completed barometer. It was beautiful in its simplicity. No hidden mechanisms, no secret purposes, just an honest instrument for measuring atmospheric pressure. Yet he knew that even this simple device would be seen by some as prophetic, its readings interpreted as omens rather than measurements.
People will always seek meaning beyond mechanism, Jacob observed, having returned to inspect the finished work. It's human nature to want the universe to care about our small dramas. Let them, our craftsman replied, carefully crating the barometer for delivery. As long as the instrument itself remains honest, people can project whatever meaning they need. The danger comes when we modify the instrument to support our projections. Anna had finished her day's work on Henri's notes, producing several pages of clear warnings about mercury exposure, its symptoms, and prevention methods. These would be distributed to workshops throughout Switzerland, a lasting legacy of a young man whose curiosity had cost him his life. As they closed the workshop for the evening, our craftsman stood for a moment in the doorway, looking back at the space that had been his solitary domain for so many years.
Now it hummed with new energy, Thomas's eager questions, Anna's scientific rigor, even Jacob's competitive friendship adding layers to what had been a simple, lonely existence. "Second thoughts?" Anna asked, noting his pause. "No," he replied, pulling the door closed and locking it carefully. "Simply observing that workshops, like families, can be transformed by truth. For years I worked alone, thinking solitude was necessary for precision. But precision without purpose is merely mechanical. Henri knew that. It's why he asked the difficult questions at Montrose." They walked through Geneva's evening streets, the gas lamps casting pools of yellow light in the November darkness. The city was changing. More factories, more railways, more instruments to measure and quantify the world. Yet human nature remained stubbornly unmeasurable, resisting all attempts to predict or control it. "I received another letter today," Anna mentioned as they neared her lodgings. "From Ernst. He begins his studies next month. He says the barometer still stands in the Great Hall, and every morning his father checks it, comparing its reading to the weather outside. Simple correlation, no interpretation. A good beginning, our craftsman said. Trust must be rebuilt slowly, like crafting a new instrument from quality materials." As he returned to his own rooms above the workshop, our craftsman reflected on the past month's events. He'd set out to repair a barometer and instead had dismantled an entire architecture of deception. The Hausers would never again trust mechanical prophecy, but perhaps they'd learn to trust each other. Settling into his chair with a simple supper of bread and cheese, he opened his notebook to make a final entry about the Montrose affair. November 6th. New barometer completed for university. Built with absolute honesty of purpose. Workshop expanded with new assistant and apprentice. The Montrose barometer stands true. No longer a prophet, but simply a measure of air pressure, as Torricelli intended. The family reports gradual adjustment to life without mechanical prediction. Weather tonight? Clear. Stars visible. Mercury steady at 30.2 inches. Some things at least can be measured accurately. He closed the notebook and looked out his window at Lake Geneva, its surface calm in the windless night.
Somewhere across that water, Villa Montrose stood with its honest barometer, its recovering family, its secrets laid bare. The mercury in that great tube would rise and fall with the weather, nothing more, nothing less. And perhaps, he thought as sleep began to claim him, that was prophecy enough. That pressure changes, that storms pass, that equilibrium eventually returns. Not through manipulation or deception, but through the simple, immutable laws that govern both instruments and hearts.
The workshop below was silent now, but tomorrow it would fill again with the sounds of honest craftsmanship. The filing of brass, the grinding of glass, the careful calibration of truth.